Good morning. I am Robert Herr, United States Attorney for the District of Maryland. We are here today to announce the federal indictment of 3 defendants in one of the largest fraud schemes ever charged in Maryland, as well as a parallel enforcement action being taken by the Securities and Exchange Commission. With me today are Gordon Johnson, Special Agent in charge of the FBI's Baltimore Division, and Stephanie Avakian, co-director of the SEC's Enforcement Division. We're also joined by Assistant U.S. Attorney Joyce McDonald, one of the prosecutors working with the FBI and the SEC on this investigation. Her co-counsel, Martin Clark, is in Texas overseeing the proceedings there. Yesterday, federal agents arrested 3 men: Kevin Merrill of Towson, Maryland, Jay Ledford of both Las Vegas, Nevada, and Texas, and Cameron Jezierski, also of Texas, in connection with a $364 million Ponzi scheme. A federal grand jury returned a sealed indictment on September 11th, charging the defendants with conspiracy, wire fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. When we arrested the defendants yesterday, we took numerous steps to freeze and recover property believed to have been bought with proceeds of their fraudulent scheme. Federal agents have seized numerous luxury cars and luxury jewelry. We've also entered restraining orders against 9 homes and a share in a jet aircraft, and the SEC has frozen numerous bank accounts. According to the indictment, the defendants defrauded their investors through an elaborate web of lies, duping them into paying millions of dollars into this Ponzi scheme. The defendants lured their victims with promises of an investment opportunity that seemed too good to be true. Unfortunately, it was too good to be true. As set forth in the indictment, the defendants told the prospective investors that they stood to make money through the purchase and sale of consumer debt portfolios. That phrase, consumer debt portfolios, is a fancy way of referring to bundles of debt that people owe on their credit cards, student loans, car loans, and the like. The defendant's purported plan was to buy up bundles of this kind of debt and make money off of it in 2 ways. First, by collecting the payments that people made on their credit card debt, student loan debt, etc., and also by quickly selling these bundles of debt to other people for more than the defendants paid for it in a practice called flipping. Now, the indictment spells out all of the many lies that the defendants told investors about this scheme in order to fool them into parting with their money. The defendants allegedly lied to their investors about every conceivable aspect of the investment scheme they concocted: who the defendants were buying the debt portfolios from, how much the defendants were paying for these debt portfolios, whether the defendants were investing their own money in this so-called opportunity and not just other people's money, whether and when the defendants were making any money on the debt portfolios by collecting money from the consumers who owed the debt, whether and when the defendants were making any money on the debt portfolios by selling or flipping the portfolios, and when the defendants did pay some so-called profits to investors, where that money came from. The indictment alleges that the defendants did the following in order to fool their victims into investing their money. They falsified bank wire transfer records and bank statements. They simply made up the prices that they allegedly paid for debt portfolios. They simply made up reports about debt that they had collected on the portfolios and then gave these fake documents to investors. They created a web of shell companies and bank accounts to move money around. They created false debt portfolio overviews and sales agreements to show to prospective investors. And they themselves often made no investment in the debt portfolios, or they simply faked their investment in the portfolios. The defendants allegedly told these lies in order to keep this Ponzi scheme going, and also to enrich themselves. To keep the money coming in, the defendants needed to tell these lies and pay out some money to their investors occasionally in order to do 2 things. 1, to keep the investors that they had, and 2, to lure new investors, more investors, into the scheme. That is how a Ponzi scheme works. You pay your early investors with some money, that you get from later investors. Now, it is important to note that, as alleged in the indictment, the defendants went to great lengths to fool their victims. Some of the victims tried to kick the tires on this investment opportunity, so to speak, by asking to see bank statements and other third-party documents to support what the defendants were telling them. Now, the defendants gave these victim investors the proof that they asked for by simply making it up. For example, they allegedly created 2 companies and gave them names that sounded like a real consumer lender and a real debt portfolio broker, and opened bank accounts in these companies' names. And that made the bank records and the phony transactions listed in those bank records seem real to those investors who were doing their homework on this investment opportunity that the defendants presented to them. Now, the indictment also charges Merrill and Ledford with a money laundering conspiracy. In other words, they engaged in financial transactions in order to hide the money they had stolen from victim investors. For example, they concealed a portion of the money they'd stolen from their victims by buying a home for $10.5 million in Florida. Now, the graphic here to my right helps to illustrate the scheme. And you'll see on the left side of the chart, Mr. Merrill and Mr. Ledford, who are presenting opportunities to the investors about these consumer debt portfolios. The money that's being collected from the investors is then going into numerous bank accounts being held in the name of these companies established by Mr. Merrill and Mr. Ledford. The money then goes into several different streams. Some of it, the top stream, is reinvested by investors. When money is paid out to investors by the defendants, they are then persuaded by the defendants to reinvest, to say, this is a great opportunity, you've made some money, why don't you invest more in order to make more money? There's also some money that's being diverted to the defendants themselves in order to fund their lavish lifestyle. And finally, there's other money that's being used to fund expenses of the scheme. And down below the dotted line, you'll see numerous categories of the different kinds of lies and fake documents that the defendants told to victim investors in order to lure them into participating in this scheme. Now, the indictment alleges that Mr. Merrill and Mr. Ledford used the money that they stole from their victims to fund lavish lifestyles, as I said, including the purchase of over 20 high-end automobiles, 9 real estate purchases or renovations, a share in a jet aircraft, over $8.3 million in watches, jewelry, and collectibles, and over $25 million in casino gambling. And to my right here, you'll see photographs of some of the homes and the automobiles that are described in the indictment. One of our highest priorities in fraud cases is to recover the proceeds of fraud schemes like this one in order to restore money to the victims. And we use a tool called forfeiture in order to seize assets that defendants have bought with stolen money in order to return that money to folks who have been defrauded. To that end, the indictment seeks from Kevin Merrill the forfeiture of $39 million in cash, 6 homes in Maryland and Florida, 25 motorcycles and automobiles, including 2 Rolls Royces, 4 Lamborghinis, 4 Ferraris, a Bugatti, a Pagani, a McLaren, and other luxury models, a 35-foot luxury motor cruiser boat, and luxury jewelry. The indictment also seeks from Jay Ledford the forfeiture of $34.6 million in cash, 3 homes in Nevada and Texas, a Ferrari, a Tesla, and a Bentley automobile, and more luxury jewelry. For the crimes alleged in the indictment, Merrill and Ledford each face up to 262 years in federal prison, and Jezierski faces up to 120 years in federal prison. It's important to note that yesterday, federal prosecutors, FBI agents, and our SEC partners together interrupted an ongoing fraud scheme that was still going on, with the potential to victimize even more people. Working together, we got to the bottom of this alleged scheme in less than a year, which may sound like a long time, but for large and complex financial fraud investigations like this one, it's actually very quick. We interrupted this fraud on a single day with arrests, search warrants, and seizure warrants in Maryland, Nevada, and Texas, with 2 goals in mind: to preserve all of the evidence of the crimes that we allege in the indictment, and 2, to preserve all of the assets in order to restore money to the victim investors and to try to minimize the losses that they suffer. According to the SEC's complaint, the victim investors included small business owners, restaurateurs, construction contractors, retirees, doctors, lawyers, accountants, bankers, talent agents, professional athletes, and financial advisors located in Maryland, Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia, Las Vegas, Texas, and elsewhere. Most of these investors are just learning now that they have been victimized, and we urge folks who think they may be victims to contact the FBI. And there's information on this poster to my right about how they can do that. Just a reminder, an indictment is not a finding of guilt. An individual charged by indictment is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty at a later criminal proceeding. It's been 10 years since the financial crisis of 2008. It's all too easy to forget that our nation's financial system is built on trust, and that the entire system can be shaken when that underlying trust is shaken. And cases like this one are a prime example of the kind of conduct that can seriously erode trust. The consequences for the victims in this case can be devastating, but the ripple effects can be felt much further beyond. Now I'd like to turn it over to FBI Special Agent in Charge, Gordon Johnson.
Good morning. Again, I'm Gordon Johnson, the Special Agent in Charge of the FBI's Baltimore Field Office. I would like to begin by thanking the employees of the FBI Baltimore office for their work to get us to this point in the investigation. I also want to thank the men and women from the FBI's Dallas, Las Vegas, and Tampa divisions for their important assistance in this investigation. I also want to thank the United States Attorney's Office, specifically the United States Attorney Rob Herr, and the support from his team, along with the Securities Exchange Commission for their partnership and collaboration in this investigation. We are proud to stand and work so closely with everyone involved in this investigation. When people are victimized by financial fraud, the FBI and our partners are committed to vigorous investigation to hold those responsible for these criminal misdeeds. As alleged, these defendants lied about their intentions regarding the investors' money, pocketing a large portion for their own personal use. Mr. Merrill and Ledford deceived investors out of millions of dollars, causing significant financial harm for their own personal gain and lavish lifestyles. It is our belief that victims of Merrill and Ledford's illegal activity are scattered throughout the United States. The FBI is encouraging anyone who believes they are an investor victim, regardless of the loss amount, to contact the FBI by filling out a questionnaire at www.fbi.gov/Merrill Ledford. Again, www.fbi.gov/Merrill Ledford. Or you can email us at merrillledford@fbi.gov. This contact information will be posted on our @FBI Baltimore Twitter page later this afternoon. We believe that there are at least 400 victims, but actually the number could be much larger. A large number of the investor victims believed to be located here in the Baltimore area, possibly Northern Virginia and the Texas region, Dallas, Texas region. We also know investor victims are scattered across other areas of the United States. This is why it's critical, if you think you are an investor victim, to come forward so that we can see how you play into this larger investigation. We are committed to protecting investors from illegal, deceptive practices. This is an important key for the FBI because these victims often go unnoticed and unnamed, and it's important that we remain committed to identify these types of schemes and pursue them as strongly and vigorously as we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gordon. We'll now hear from Stephanie Avakian, the SEC's Co-Director of Enforcement.
Thanks very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Stephanie Avakian, and I'm co-director of the SEC's Division of Enforcement. And I'd like to start by giving thanks also first to Rob Herr and his team here at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Baltimore, as well as to Gordon Johnson of the FBI's Baltimore Field Office, Robert Manchak from the FHFA's Office of the Inspector General, and all the agents who worked on the parallel criminal matter. Last night, the SEC unsealed a complaint alleging securities fraud by Kevin Merrill, Jay Ledford, Cameron Jazierski, and several entities under Merrill and Ledford's control. The SEC's complaint alleges that the defendants were operating a massive offering fraud, cheating hundreds of investors out of hundreds of millions of dollars by inducing those investors to buy what was described as investments in consumer debt portfolios and promising significant profits. We allege that in reality this was a fraud and that the defendants used a web of lies, fabricated documents, and forged signatures in an elaborate scheme to entice investors and continue the fraud. Rather than using investor funds to purchase and service debt portfolios as promised, the defendants allegedly used investors' money to make Ponzi-like payments to earlier investors and to enrich themselves. The SEC's complaint alleges that the defendants stole at least $85 million of the investor funds to maintain lavish lifestyles, spending millions of dollars on luxury items, including more than $10 million on at least 25 high-end cars, $330,000 for a 7-carat diamond ring, $168,000 for a 23-carat diamond bracelet, and millions of dollars on luxury homes. And this case highlights the real-time enforcement work of the SEC staff in detecting and connecting the dots in this far-reaching and very complicated scheme. As detailed in our complaint, Merrill and Ledford raised at least $345 million since the start of 2015 through the sale of securities that took various forms, the most common of which were investment contracts and notes. And they sold these securities to hundreds of individuals and pooled vehicles, including family offices and hedge funds. In one representative example, an individual investor entered into an investment contract investing $500,000 that was supposedly earmarked for 2 specific debt portfolios. But rather than acquire the debt portfolios, Merrill allegedly used the investor's money on a $400,000 initial payment for a 2014 Pagani sports car to make $54,000 of Ponzi-like payments to prior investors and to repay approximately $20,000 of his own credit card debt. In another example that also illustrates the Ponzi-like elements of this fraud, a group of pooled investment vehicles that we describe in the complaint as the Boulder Group made an investment of $900,000. And after receiving these funds, we allege that Ledford wired approximately $483,000 to his personal bank account and used most of the balance of the investor funds to repay prior investors. We allege that Ledford then sent more than $86,000 back to the Boulder Group in the guise of profits that the Boulder Group supposedly realized from earlier investments, and thereby giving those investors reason to believe that their money was being invested when actually it had been stolen. While these are pretty straightforward examples of the fraud, our complaint details other examples of very complex transactions that appear to have been designed to be difficult to trace. We allege that the defendants intentionally created a web of entities and accounts that were hidden behind seemingly legitimate businesses. And all told, we allege that Merrill, Ledford, and Jazierski used more than 32 corporate entities and over 55 associated bank accounts to move investor money, deceive investors, and continue the scheme. Despite the breadth and complexity of the alleged scheme, we worked quickly to secure all possible funds under the control of the defendants. And to that end, we have obtained an ex parte temporary restraining order and an order appointing a temporary receiver. Both orders were entered by the United States District Court here in Maryland last Thursday and were unsealed last night. These orders freeze all assets of Merrill, Ledford, and Jazierski and the entities they control, and appoint a receiver who, under the court's authority, controls the defendant's assets and entities. And our expectation is that, together with the seizures by the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI, the asset freeze and receivership that we secured will preserve millions of dollars in proceeds of the fraud that we will be able to return to victims upon the successful conclusion of this litigation. Protecting investors and holding bad actors accountable are two of the Enforcement Division's highest priorities. And in this case, we stopped an ongoing fraud in real time, thereby preventing further harm and preserving assets for harmed investors. The fast-paced work of our team in unraveling this complex fraud is a testament to the dedication and talent of the staff of the SEC in our Philadelphia regional office. Norman Ostrov, Dustin Ruda, Scott Thompson, Julie Green, Mark Sylvester, and Jennifer Barry, under the supervision of Kelly Gibson and Jeff Bajukas, as well as those in the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI who worked on this matter. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. We have some time for questions if you all have any. Ann?
Yeah, can you tell us how you learned about this in as much detail as you can, and do you think any of the victims, or how are you notifying the victims? And,
Yep.
yeah.
I think Gordon might be best positioned to talk about that.
So this case first came to our attention through a tip, and we took that information and then began to unravel the scenario based on the tip that came into our office.
Can you say if that was an investment advisor or an investor?
Yeah, I don't think I should comment further on that right now, but it was a tip that came in, and that's why we are encouraging people that if they think they're an investor victim to please contact us, because you don't know where it will lead. Thank you.
When did you get the tip? Can you say when?
I think I'm going to defer to the U.S. Attorney for that, because this is part of the prosecution and ongoing development here. But I would say it was within the last year that we got the tip. I wouldn't characterize it any further than that.
And how you're notifying the victims? You said some of them are just learning about it today.
So that's part of what we're trying to do, because we are still identifying victims as the investigation goes on. The anticipation is over the next months, maybe weeks to months, we will be going back as we identify the victims to talk to them as well.
Can you help me understand a little bit more about where Jernitsky comes in? What exactly was his role in this scheme?
Yeah, well, as I'm sure you can appreciate at this point, the matter has not been adjudicated to resolution.
I mean, alleged role in this scheme.
The alleged role in the scheme. So again, I'm limited at this point in the matter to what's laid out in the four corners of the indictment. So at this point, all I can say is that Jezierski did work. He was a co-conspirator with Mr. Merrill and Mr. Ledford in trying to draw investors in and also establish and set up some of the lies that were being told to investors in order to lure them into investing with them.
Can you
Mr.
tell us
Hurd?
about the emergency relief that are you just referring to the forfeiture procedures?
Yeah, I think you might be referring to what Ms. Avakian was talking about. Is that right?
Yeah, we got emergency relief, which comprises both an asset freeze over all their assets, and a receiver's been appointed to oversee the assets and keep them from being dissipated.
Is it expected that the victims could somehow access this in a timely manner, or?
Typically, I think it's too soon to tell exactly how it plays out, but typically at the conclusion of the litigation, whatever is left will be distributed in some fashion, whether it's done by the receiver through an SEC Fair Fund or something else. But that is, the anticipation is that these assets will be preserved for return to harmed investors.
And is that one receiver for both Merrill and Ledford, or do they have two separate receivers for their assets?
It's one receiver.
As we saw in the Madoff scandal,
Yes.
investors got very little back. Realistically, how much will these investors end up getting back, and what help are you offering them in terms of that?
Yes. So as I said, one of our primary concerns here is to try to restore as much of the stolen money and the assets into which that money was plowed to the victims, because we want to try to make them as whole as possible. So at this point, all I can tell you is that the investigation is ongoing. We're continuing to look for any other assets that we can seize in order to use to make the victims whole. That is certainly one of our prime goals, and it's something that the FBI and the SEC and the Justice Department are all working together to try to do. But at this point, it's the matter's still ongoing. It's difficult to say.
Mr. Hurd?
Yes.
You brought up Bernie Madoff. Everyone's aware of that. These people had a lot of money to invest. I saw some of them were $200 million is about professionally managed money, or at least organized funds. How on earth were they duped? How good were these guys? What was their sales pitch? And what's the message to everyone else out there as well?
Yeah, well, I think it's a very good question, and as is set forth in the indictment, there were, as I said, lies being told to prospective investors about almost every conceivable aspect of the scheme. And I think it is also important to note that, as set forth in the indictment, there were rather extraordinary steps, including identity theft, being undertaken by the defendants in order to fool those victim investors who, in their view, they were taking appropriate and warranted steps in order to try to, I said, kick the tires on this investment opportunity. But these particular defendants, they allegedly took steps like setting up a web of shell companies, setting up bank accounts in the names of those companies, falsifying bank and wire transfer records, just completely out and out fabricating debt collection reports and sales agreements. So they set up many layers of deception to try to lure people into their scheme. So, of course, I think the message is, from these types of matters, we really, really regret deeply all of the losses that are being suffered by the victims. So, do your homework, but this is a case in which, according to the indictment, some investors did their homework and the defendants found a way to lure those folks in nonetheless.
You know what, I can ask you privately, but pictures of these guys would really help with your effort to ferret out more victims.
It's a good point, and we'll work with the FBI and the SEC to try to make that happen.
Are all three of these people in custody, or are they on bond?
Mr. Merrill is detained, and his detention hearing is scheduled for Thursday. Mr. Ledford was arrested in Las Vegas, Nevada, and he had his detention hearing yesterday, and he was ordered detained by a judge. And Mr. Jezierski was released on conditions. But he was also arrested in Las Vegas, and he is required to report here no later than September 24th. Yes, sir.
As far as dollars go, this isn't anywhere near the scope of Madoff, but in just your own experience, having worked on other cases, how does this kind of compare to other? What is the scope of this case? How big is it?
Sure. Well, I think one rough and ready measure is the amount of the intended loss here. The intended loss here, as shown on the chart, is $364 million. So off the top of my head, I think the loss figures in the Madoff matter and the Stanford matter were larger, but that's one quick and easy way of measuring it. Now, of course, to some of the individual victims in this case, they're less concerned with the overall loss exacted by the defendants, and they're more concerned with the funds that they've invested and lost. And it's tragic with respect to all the victims, but it's particularly tragic. I mentioned some of the victims here are retirees. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that some of the investors, some of the victims, did their homework and they were looking into what was going on.
Correct.
But if a scheme like this continues working and then there are so many others still that were taken, how is there any way to really determine that the documents that you're being shown are false or real? Is there any way to really determine that these are how the documents are, that whether they're real or not?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's part of, frankly, what makes the investigation and the unraveling of schemes like this a difficult one, because you have to wade through layers of those kinds of lies and deception that the defendants allegedly engaged in. So I agree, it's difficult for the victims, and as I said again, that's part of the real heartache at the root of cases like this. Yes.
You said this investigation is ongoing. Could there be more people involved in the scheme, and could it be more investors, and could it be more money? Are we going to see other indictments coming out after this?
All I can say at this point is the investigation continues.